Well, guys, so now we're gonna jump into a section here inside of Blender that's, to be honest, one of my favorite sections in the whole 3D world. I love sculpting. Sculpting is a very, very cool part of the creation process, and it's what's gonna allow us to get to this amount of detail that we have right here. Some of you might think of this piece right here against like a stone piece and be like, well, probably the easiest way to do this was to add a lot of edges and a lot of bevels and cut here and cut there. But to be honest, this is the kind of stuff that we do with sculpting nowadays. Sculpting has been around for more than 15 years now. I remember when I got into the industry, ZBrush was like the hot thing in that moment, and Blender has been doing this as well for the past like several years. They've improved their sculpting tools quite a bit. So I'm going to show you something here about the sculpting elements. First of all, I like to move my little things right here to display the names of the brushes so that it's easier to teach and to explain. The movement here inside of the element is exactly the same. However, you will need a tablet. Okay, I'm not sure if I mentioned this on the um, on the intro video, but one of the necessary things for us to get the most out of this is to use a tablet. You can get a very cheap like Wacom tablet, like the Intuos or like this, I don't know, Uji. Like there are a lot of brands. Personally, I'm using a Hoyon Canvas 16, which is a pen display, similar to like this one right here. But you can use any tablet as long as you have pen pressure, which is what the sculpting is going to be working with. Now, in order for us to work with sculpting, we actually need to work with a lot of resolution. Let me go back to the layout mode, and let's bring in a very quick sphere right here. So the way sculpting works is actually very interesting. I'm gonna grab this guy right here, and we're gonna jump into sculpting mode. And as you can see over here, we're now in the sculpting mode. You can only have one object in sculpting mode at the same time. So in this case, we're working with this sphere. And the way it works is, as you can see, when I pass my little pen on top of the sphere, I'm modifying the position of the vertices. It looks like I'm adding volume, but I'm not adding any more vertices or any more points. I'm just pushing and pulling them to create a different form. We're gonna be using what's the word? There's the middle mouse button to rotate around. So middle mouse button will rotate around. I'm not sure why it's not working right now on my Hoyon tablet, but I personally changed the options here on my pen to mouse key, middle mouse button. There we go. So now when I press a middle mouse button, I'm gonna be, did it work? It should be working. There we go. There we go. So now when I press middle mouse button, I'm gonna be rotating around. You're gonna press shift and middle mouse to pan around, and control and middle mouse to rotate. Some people like to use the shortcuts on their tablets. I actually move my keyboard to the side, so I'm using my left hand to press these things. I'm not sure if I can display the screencast things over here. It doesn't seem like it because it's a little bit more precise. So you're gonna have to just follow along with this part right here. Now, again, one of the things that we're going to be doing here, as I explained, is we're going to be pushing and pulling vertices up and down. However, to get more detail, we need more vertices. And there's a couple of ways to do it. One of them is to use a multi-resolution modifier. This multi-resolution is very cool because it allows us to change the amount of elements that we have right here by subdividing. I'm going to subdivide once, twice, let's say 3 times. And when we go back to layout, as you can see, we're not going to be seeing all of those polygons active. But when we're in sculpting mode, we're going to be sculpting in subdivision level 3. And also, when we render, we're going to display the subdivision level 3. So this, what allows us to do is we have more points, and therefore we can modify this object a lot more. The reason why the tablet is so important is because with the tablet, we can control how intense or not the effect is going to be. So right now, if I tap very softly, as you can see, we get a very soft effect right there. And if I tap really strongly, I'm going to get a very strong effect. So this sort of like abstract control that we have over our object is what's going to allow us to give all of these forms that we're looking for on our element. Now, even though multi-res is a really good way to do it, and we might be using this for some shapes, one of the ways that I like to work while we're inside of this thing is by using the remesh function. So if you guys are familiar with ZBrush, remesh works very similar to Dynamesh. And the way this works is you literally just click remesh, and what's going to happen is the whole object is going to be like voxelized into, well, not voxelized, it's kind of like voxelized. It's going to create a lot of like triangles and squares pretty much everywhere. The lower the voxel size is, the smaller everything it will be. You can actually use the letter R to set up the size of the voxels that you want to have. So the smaller the size, the more polygons we're going to have, and the bigger the size, the bigger the polygon. So if we go, let's say 0.1 right there, and I hit Control R is a shortcut, we're going to remesh. So if we go R and we go smaller, and we say Control R, these squares are going to be smaller. The smaller the squares, the more detail we're going to be able to get. But of course, the performance will also suffer on your computer because Blender needs to think about more polygons at the same time. Now, one cool way in which you can visualize how many polygons you have is by going to this options right here and activating this thing called statistics. So over here, it's going to tell you, hey, right now there are 18,000 points on your screen. If I bring my voxel size up and I remesh, the amount of voxels or the amount of points is going to be going down because we're not thinking about as many points. So this is a good way to, again, to visualize how many points you have. There's no specific like limit on how many you can have. It depends on your system. So for me, I can go to like 5 or 10 million polygons without that much of an issue on a single object. But that's why it's recommended to split your objects into multiple parts. Now, if you want to jump from one object to the other, you can just press Shift and Alt, or sorry, Control and Alt. Oh my God, I always forget about this shortcut. Alt-Q is a shortcut. Sorry, my friends. I get confused with other softwares as well. So Alt-Q, as you can see, will allow me to switch between the active sculpting element. You cannot have multiple elements. You could join them, but again, the amount of polygons could provide or could prove complicated. So if I go to this one and I press Alt-Q, you can see it highlights orange, and now we can start working. Now, we're getting a warning here. It says object has non-uniform scales, so certain things will not work properly. I'm going to go back to layout mode. Let's delete this sphere. We don't need it anymore. I'm going to grab this guy right here, and I'm going to press Control A to apply all transforms. Now we can go to sculpting mode, and we can start working on this piece. But to do that, of course, we want to remesh. So we're going to say just Control R. And as you can see, we get this remesh. There might be some issues that we find, like that point right there. That's perfectly normal. We can also press and make our scale a little bit smaller. Let's go for something like a 0.2. There we go, and hit Control R, and that should give us a little bit of a cleaner shape. Now that we have this, we can start using all of the different brushes that we have right here to create the shape and get as close as possible to what we have in the reference. So, for instance, look at this guy right here, right? We have a very nice little like form over in this area. I'm going to turn on symmetry, by the way. Up here, you can turn on symmetry X, and as you can see, it's going to be happening on both sides. This is very important because our X will be symmetrical. And I'm going to go with clay strips. I love clay strips for this sort of thing. And the only thing you need to do is you literally just need to start drawing. And as you can see, we're going to start creating volume. If you press Control while you're drawing, you're going to be doing the negative action of your object. So in this case, we're going to be removing from the mesh. I can definitely tell that this is still very low geometry, like 2,000 points is way, way too little. So I'm going to press R. I'm going to make this way, way, way smaller. Let's try 0.005. I know this might be like a lot right now, but we're going to go there and press Control R. So now, as you can see, when I start sculpting, look at how much detail we can get. And 50,000 polygons is not that much. It's still in a good position. So by using my clay strips right there, I'm going to start just creating this sort of like banding, either by pressing Control to make this a negative, as you can see right there, or by keeping it positive. And we're going to start creating the sort of like stone effect that we have right there. Very important to keep our reference here close so that we can get a nice result and understand what we're doing. So Control. There's another tool that I really like. It's called the Scrape. Scrape's like Trim Dynamic if you're familiar with ZBrush. So this one, as you can see, allows me to do this. By the way, guys, if you're familiar with ZBrush, feel free to do this in ZBrush as well. I want to do this whole tutorial inside of Blender so that anyone that's using Blender can benefit from the information. But all of these things that we're doing here can be done in ZBrush exactly the same way. So there we go. Let's jump back to clay strips and start doing this. Now, another very important shortcut that we can use for our sculpting techniques right here is the F key. F is to make the brush smaller or bigger. In this case, I'm going to make it a little bit smaller and just click, and that way I can continue working on this part. Another very, very fun brush that we're going to be using, and this is going to be, for instance, important to create this division right here, is the Draw Sharp. Draw Sharp is kind of like a knife that will allow me, as you can see, to carve in and create a nice transition between the different sections. See how it's a lot easier to generate this sort of like stone effect by using this technique than it is by like traditionally modeling? That's why nowadays, if you look for a job at any studio, you will be required to know sculpting and modeling. Like it's very important that you are proficient at both skills. Let's switch back to our clay strips and just keep adding a little bit of volume here. I like to use the clay strips to add volume, as you just saw right there. For instance, let's add some volume here to create the sort of like silhouette of the element. And then we can switch to the scrape brush and flatten that volume to give it this sort of like stone-like effect. So we make it a little bit more angular. Later on, of course, the texture that we're going to be using, which is going to be a stone texture, is also going to help. So the main thing that we want to capture, or we want to work in when we're doing this sort of things, is to capture the shape, like the general silhouette of the element. So as you can see, this already, like the upper part, is already looking a lot closer to this than what we had on the initial element. Now, it is important to analyze this and try to find like the proper proportions. For instance, I see 1, 2, 3, and then this very big 4 one that goes pretty much towards the center. So I'm gonna go with my clay strips again. I'm gonna draw this big, like 4th one that goes up towards this section. So that's like the 4 ones. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then after the 4 one, we got this like big stone right here that I can also like very quickly sketch. This one right here, and then this one is very interesting because it starts small on the front side, but it creates a big element here on the back side. And then the border is very important. We're gonna kind of like go outside and create like the insertion point with the metal bit on the bottom. Right now it looks like a it looks like a turd. It looks very bad, very ugly. But we're gonna be polishing this in the next couple of videos to generate something that looks even better. So yeah, let's just keep going. We have a couple of minutes. I know I try to keep the video short, but sculpting is always very relaxing to me. Now, one thing that I do need to mention about sculpting, my friends, is that unfortunately I cannot tell you exactly like how hard I'm pressing on certain areas. So this is one of those skills that you definitely need to practice quite a bit. If this is the first time you're sculpting, be very patient with yourself. I'm using the scrape brush now here to flatten some of these areas. Be very patient because it's a skill that's very organic, like opposed to modeling where I can tell you exactly on what axis to move and what things to do. For this particular one, you will need to be a little bit more artistic in your approach. So here, for instance, again, I'm focusing on this guy right there. I'm gonna start carving to separate this stone from the other ones and create this sort of like layering effect. This the draw sharp, by the way, it's also a very cool tool to use control and do it inversely. So instead of carving in, you're going to be like bringing a line out, which again is very good to give it this sort of effect. If you start getting some lumpy areas, another thing you can do is just press shift. Shift by default is the smooth brush right here. So as you can see, it's going to allow you to smooth. Just be very careful because it is quite aggressive. So one thing you can do is go to the smooth brush and then reduce the strength right here, so that when you are on any other brush and you press a smooth, it's not as intense. Okay, so shift is the shortcut for that particular brush. Let's keep scraping there, sharpening it up, and later on we're gonna be adding like the stone details or the rock details, like the cracks. Right now, again, we're focusing on the primary shapes. So I think I'm gonna do a video before we continue with the sculpting, talking about that, like primary shapes, secondary shapes, and things like that, because it's one of those principles of sculpting that that's very important to know. I normally teach that in my sculpting courses, and we're gonna go over it in the next one as well, or in the next video. So yeah, make sure to save. This is very important. We're gonna start working with heavier polygons. So especially if your computer is on the low end of the spectrum, you might be running into some performance issues. So it's very important that we save to make sure that we're not running into any issues. So I'm gonna stop the video right here, guys. And in the next one, as I explained, we're gonna go through primary shapes, secondary or primary forms, secondary forms, and tertiary forms lesson, so that we can get even better results here in our sculpting. So yeah, hang on tight, and I'll see you back on the next one.